All right, we're back. This is Govern America. I'm Darren Weeks. As we continue on here, our guest is Dr. Tim Ball. He's a professor, or was, at the University of Manitoba, University of Winnipeg at Manitoba in Canada, and he's a climatologist, ladies and gentlemen, somebody that Al Gore says doesn't exist, apparently, because he is disputing the notion of anthropogenic greenhouse warming, warming caused by you and I. Through our everyday lifestyle, normal human activity is being demonized today, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that and why it's happening, the agenda behind some of this so-called climate science in a moment. But Dr. Ball, you were talking before the break about how the Climate Research Institute was established there at UAE.
Yeah. Okay, and what happened was that, and you have to understand that I'm not going to take the University of East Anglia off the hook completely on this, because it is considered to be a very left-wing university amongst left-wing universities in England. And as Hubert Lamb got older, and he worked right almost up to his death in his 90s, but a fellow by the name of Tom Wigley took over. And one of the things, before I go further with this, what I want the audience to have in the back of their mind is this question. When you stand outside, you experience weather. And that weather is the sum total, is what scientists call white noise. That is, it's made up of individual red noises, so that everything from, say, cosmic radiation in deep space to heat coming off the bottom of the oceans all mixes up in the atmosphere to give you the weather that you're feeling. And what I want them to think about is that CO2 is an absolutely minuscule portion of that total system. And yet it has become the sole focus. So it's almost like saying, well, look, we're going to do a study on Darren Weeks, what makes him tick. And, oh, by the way, we're just going to look at this one little wart on his left arm. And that's going to be, that will represent him. Okay? That's how bad the science of this is. And, of course, then the question is, well, why the focus on CO2? And we'll get back to that in a minute.
Yeah.
But there's another agenda that was going along with this, because there are two parallel things going on. One is the corruption of the science, of course, through that focus on CO2. The other is, and I want to read you a quote here from the second report of the Club of Rome. Now, a lot of your listeners will be familiar with that, Paul Ehrlich and Limits to Growth and so on. And in 1974, they came out with a report called Mankind at the Turning Point. And here's what it says. It would seem that humans need a common motivation, either a real one or else one invented for the purpose. In searching for a new enemy to unite us, we came up with the idea that pollution, the threat of global warming, water shortages, famine, and the like would fit the bill. All these dangers are caused by human intervention, and it is only through changed attitudes and behavior that they can be overcome. Okay? There's the statement. Okay, now one of the people that was involved in that was a fellow by the name of Maurice Strong.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sad to say a Canadian who came from the prairies of Canada, and his family was almost communist in its beliefs. And I know that because I've talked to people who went to school with him and knew the family personally and so on. And Morris went to the U.S. and made a lot of money as a capitalist, but then, of course, became what the English call a champagne socialist. And he's the one that was with that Club of Rome and took that idea, and he took he made the statement about 30 years ago, and the listeners can read about this in a book called The Cloak of Green. And this is a very good book, Darren, because as a journalist, you would appreciate the woman that wrote it, Elaine Dewar, wanted to write a book praising the environmentalists in Canada, like Elizabeth May and David Suzuki and Strong. But the more she did her research, the more she realized that these people were more corrupt than the corporations that they were attacking. Mm-hmm. And so she wrote this book, Cloak of Green, and which implies that underneath they're not green at all.
Yeah.
They're red, you know. And so anyway,
one guest that we had on the show in the past, who was talking about weather modification, he called them watermelons because they're red in the middle and green on the outside.
Yeah, I've heard that term. Yes, exactly, and all of those sorts of terms. Yeah, but anyway, Strong made the statement that the problem for the planet are the industrialized nations, and isn't it our responsibility to get rid of them? And the question, that's a huge statement, and you can make those kind. Well, it's easy to make, but how do you put it into practice? That's the real challenge. And one of the things that we've got to acknowledge with these people, like with Al Gore, you have to acknowledge that his movie is a brilliant piece of propaganda. Mm-hmm. Whatever else it is, right? And that's why I've argued it deserved the Oscar, because it's from the land of make-believe.
Well, exactly. And that's the point. I've talked to friends who have actually went to see the movie just because, they know the whole thing is a fraud. But they just went to see, from the idea of, what's his best evidence? What's the other side's best way of viewing this? And he says, I got to tell you, the guy's nothing like he appeared on the campaign. He was funny. He was entertaining. He made his points. And, however false they might be. And the average person, it's unfortunate that this film has been shown in schools all around the world, I guess.
Well, and not only that, but he's the only Nobel Prize winner in history whose work for which he got the prize was found guilty of being politically biased with 9 major scientific errors in a UK court a week before he got the prize. It's absolutely amazing. Yeah. And by the way, and we'll get back to Strong and the CO2 in a minute, but I and the IPCC and Gore got the Nobel Prize together. I think that both of those should be rescinded. Oh. They should have to give them back, because they're all not. Here's the interesting thing: Gore based his movie on the fraud that the IPCC people produced, and he even falsified their false work. Right, that's what's amazing about it.
Yeah,
but anyway,
like the 20-foot rise in sea levels.
Oh, and they disagreed with him on that, right? Mm-hmm. But as I said, he took their hockey stick graph and he separated it to make so that you couldn't see that the temperature was driving the CO2, not as was claimed. And these people kept their mouths shut about it. And you notice they never say a word about Gore and his work. Right. Clearly they're embarrassed by him and what he's doing. But anyway, that's another whole story. But back
getting back to Strong, because I want to remind the listeners too. Morris Strong was the guy who chaired the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development in 1992, which unveiled the World Agenda 21.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. He organized that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let me put that in perspective for you, Darren, because in the book Cloak of Green, when he said, the problem of the planet, the industrialized nations, Elaine Dewar said to him, well, if you've got that serious concern, why don't you run for politics? And he made probably the only honest statement he's ever made in his life when he said, well, you can't do anything as a politician. And she said, well, how are you going to do this? And he said, well, I'm going to go to the UN because I can get all the money I want, not be accountable to anybody. And that's precisely what he did. And one of the things, and I've talked to people that worked with him, worked for him, he's incredibly manipulative, very, very smooth, but he's a superb organizer of bureaucracies and systems. And so he got into the UN and became the senior advisor to Kofi Annan and set up the United Nations Environment Program. Okay, and out of that came the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change.
Right.
So here he's setting up the science side of the climate. All right, and this is something a lot of listeners will know this intuitively, but let me give it some confirmation to it. I have chaired many commissions of inquiry, served on commissions of inquiry. Politicians love commissions of inquiry. What politicians love are vehicles that can take them out of the heat and make them look good.